Hello and welcome everybody. I'm Anthony Gonzalez and I'm the Senior Program Coordinator with the Higher Education Center for Alcohol and Drug Misuse Prevention and Recovery. And I want to welcome you all today to our webinar titled New Products, Same Nicotine, Understanding E-Cigarettes and Oral Nicotine Pouch Use Among College Students, featuring our presenter today, Dr. Megan Roberts. Before we get started with today's content, I do just have a few housekeeping slides I'd like to share with everybody. Here on the screen should look somewhat familiar as we are in the Zoom webinar format. We do welcome your questions throughout today's live session, but we do kindly ask that you utilize the Q&A feature. We do have the chat enabled for today's session, so go ahead and utilize the chat to introduce yourself as well as share any reflections and resources as it relates to today's content. But again, we do just kindly ask that you utilize the Q&A feature for any specific questions for our presenter. We do have live captioning enabled for today's session, and you can turn that on through your bottom dashboard. We also encourage everybody to learn more about becoming a member of the Higher Education Center. You can learn more about the different membership tiers and the benefits that go along with them by visiting our website at hecaod.osu.edu. Additionally, today's session has been approved for one entry-level CHES contact hour. In order to receive the CHES hour, to receive the CHES credit, you must have purchased the CHES add-on, attend the entire live session, and complete the evaluation within 2 business days. The CHES certificates will be sent out to attendees within 30 days of the live event, and credits are reported to the board on a quarterly basis. We also have quite a few upcoming events that I'd like to share with everybody. Our Recovery is Spoken Here, Train the Trainer training is taking place next week on July 15th. We have our Biennial Review Learning Collaborative taking place later this month on July 29th. Our next water cooler chat will be focusing on campus naloxone efforts. And then our next webinar taking place in August will focus on understanding cryptocurrencies in prediction markets. We also have a grant writing crash course that recently was rescheduled for September. We still have registrations available for that course. And additionally, the 2026 national meeting will be taking place in October, and early bird registration runs through the end of the month. And with that, it is my great pleasure to turn it over to our presenter today. Joining us today is Dr. Megan Roberts, Associate Professor with The Ohio State University. Thank you so much for being here with us, Dr. Roberts, and it's my pleasure turning it over to you at this time.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for attending today. I'm happy to be here. Just give me one moment to start sharing my presentation. Great. And Anthony has kindly offered to speak up if there's or post if there's any kind of real-time question coming through. I always have a hard time with my screens presenting and seeing questions, but happy to just pause and answer questions as I go along. Great. So with that, I'll get started. My presentation today is New Products, Same Nicotine, Understanding E-Cigarette and Oral Nicotine Pouch Use Among College Students. Before I get going, I want to acknowledge my many wonderful collaborators who worked with me on the research I'll be talking about and the funding that supported this work from the American Heart Association and the National Cancer Institute. Okay, so we're going to be talking about a lot of different products today, but specifically focusing on e-cigarettes and nicotine pouches. I'm guessing most people on the call today are pretty familiar with e-cigarettes. They've been around for a while, taking off substantially in 2018. There is kind of what we call this ever-changing landscape where what they look like changes, starting with kind of the pen types and box mods, and now kind of looking often like that green device in the middle, kind of geek bar. And I'll go a little bit into brands, but essentially an e-cigarette is a battery-operated device that heats a liquid to create an aerosol, which you then inhale. The liquid generally contains propylene glycol or vegetable glycerin, as well as flavorings and nicotine. Then nicotine pouches, sometimes called oral nicotine pouches or ONPs in the research community, are somewhat newer. They only entered the US market in 2016, and we've only really seen an increase in sales in the past few years. So, what are nicotine pouches? If you look at the pouches themselves, they're kind of what is appearing in that top picture. They're those kind of white little packets. I always think they look like what comes with sometimes packaging to like prevent moisture when you get something maybe shipped to you. But they're these small pouches containing nicotine, but no tobacco leaf. They generally contain other contents as well. They can include fibers, microplastics, flavorings, sweeteners, and pH regulators. And they're placed between the gums and the cheek. So they're held kind of in place in the mouth, either the top or the bottom of the jaw. Um, and your saliva dissolves the nicotine and the flavors, which allows for the rapid absorption of the nicotine into the bloodstream. And they're sold in tins or cans, like what's shown on the bottom. I'll give another example. Many different brands, so the cans themselves might look a bit different, but here are some of the more common brands you might see out there. This is from a really interesting paper where they also kind of cut open the contents so you can see what's actually inside those pouches. And it's kind of looks like a white powder. Okay. So what are the trends? What are we seeing in relation to these products as well as other tobacco products? Um, to kind of take a step back and talk about cigarette use, we've seen cigarette use peak in the US in the 1960s and then be slowly declining since then, after the Surgeon General's report came out in 1964, reporting on the health consequences of smoking. If we continue that trend out until more recent years, we can see with adults in that blue line and youth in that kind of greenish yellow line, the continued decline of cigarette smoking in the US, which is great. We're trying to, as tobacco prevention researchers, trying to get us towards that end game, that, near zero levels in the US. Looking at just youth, so this is high school data since 1991, again, similar trends across all different product types. We had kind of this spike, as I said, around 2018 with Juul e-cigarettes. But since then, e-cigarette use has also been kind of going back down generally on the decline. Of course, it has not been the same decline for all populations, and that's really important to keep looking at subgroups as well. This is from a paper I did a few years ago looking at urban and rural differences. And what we found, you can see the urban, suburban groups are in the gray line, and green is the rural groups. Although population-wise, we're seeing kind of an overall decline. It's not happening equally for all populations. For example, among rural populations, the decline has been much slower, if at all. So whenever we talk about trends, it's also important to look at subgroups to make sure we're keeping an eye on equity. Right, so what about college students? Because that's the interest of this group. This is really recent data I pulled from the American College Health Association survey. They ask about past 3-month use of various tobacco products. Here you can see among the college students sampled, 14% reported past 3-month use of e-cigarettes. 9% reported cigarette use, so that's actually kind of an uptick. And then they don't specifically ask in their survey about nicotine pouch use, so we kind of saw the other category being pretty low. We also ran our own survey last year at Ohio State University, and that kind of also gives a little bit of data point on where we're seeing trends. This was a survey published, we actually published some of the results in the Journal of American College Health. We surveyed 578 undergraduates and 888 graduate students, and we were specifically focused in this project on use of nicotine pouches. What we found here was that we asked about ever use and also past month use, which is often used to assess kind of current use. Similar to the National College Student Survey, we saw 42% ever use of e-cigarettes and 11% past month use of e-cigarettes. So similar to that other survey, e-cigarettes are by far the most commonly used tobacco product among young adults. Cigarette use was also pretty high, so 27% reported ever having tried a cigarette, and 5% were reporting kind of current use. And then we found for these nicotine pouches, 15% reported ever use, just 3% reporting past month use. And 41% of men in fraternities reported ever use. And this was the highest kind of subgroup of everything we looked at. We only added a question about Greek life to the survey because we'd just been hearing anecdotally from some of our undergrad research assistants that it was very common among frat guys. And so we added that question and it supported what, the students have been telling us, this very high use among certain groups, especially men and especially men in fraternities. Okay, so why should we be worried about this? Why should we be worried about e-cigarettes and nicotine pouches? When I try to explain and talk about this, usually I break it down into kind of two general buckets of reasons. One being the harms from the contents, so kind of what else is in those products. And then second, the harms and addiction potential from the nicotine. So both these products, e-cigarettes and nicotine pouches, contain nicotine, but they contain other contents as well that we're concerned about. Getting into e-cigarettes, using e-cigarettes, it does expose you to lower levels of some toxic chemicals compared to cigarettes. So here are just some examples from research. For example, much lower levels of heavy metals and aldehydes and things that we, should be all terrified about that's in the cigarettes. But using e-cigarettes does expose you to similar or higher levels of other toxic chemicals than cigarettes. For example, glycerol or propylene glycol. And these are things that really shouldn't be inhaled into your lungs, right? These are not safe things to be inhaling. And so that's why we worry a lot about e-cigarettes because it's not just water vapor. And in fact, when we talk to students about the harms of e-cigarettes, it seems like young people are generally aware of these harms. So, if we give them a questionnaire like this, do you know about your vapes? If we ask them, true, false, is using an e-cigarette mostly inhaling water vapor? Most people will say false. They understand that there's other products in it. They understand there's a risk for addiction and that there's other kind of components that they should be concerned about with e-cigarettes. Turning over to nicotine pouches, because they're so new, the research on harm is still emerging. So we don't have as much data to share on this. And in fact, some of the studies that are cited are conducted by the tobacco industry. And so all those we kind of have to take with a heavy grain of salt. Emerging evidence does indicate these concerns, first being gum and mouth damage. So you're holding that nicotine pouch in your mouth. Lots of young people use it kind of not just following the directions on the can, so they'll often keep them in their mouth all day long. That can irritate the oral tissue, and there's preliminary data showing that disrupts the oral microbiome. The second concern is stomach upset. So you're not swallowing the pouch. The pouch does get, thrown out or spit out at some point, but you're sucking on those juices. You're sucking on not just the nicotine and the sugars, but everything else that's in those contents. So you're swallowing the juices. People report stomach upset from using nicotine pouches, especially heavy use. And there are concerns about, what's in those pouches that's now having contact with the throat and the mouth and the stomach. So we might see, some emerging data on that in the coming years. And then, of course, just the chemical exposure. So we don't not quite know, what other chemicals companies are putting in their nicotine pouches. Right. And then, as I said, there's kind of the contents, but there's also the nicotine that's in the products. And nicotine is a chemical, and it's the addictive component of all tobacco products. Why should we be concerned about college students using nicotine? Well, prior to your mid-20s, you're more sensitive and vulnerable to the reward of nicotine. So you're more likely to develop an addiction the younger you are when you begin using a product. There are long-term irreversible effects even at low use. So nicotine alters your brain development, increases the risk of mood and attention symptoms, sensitizes the brain to other drugs, priming it for future substance use. It increases the likelihood of premature birth, right? So we have these people who are entering childbearing years. And it increases the likelihood of escalating to more harmful products. I also get some questions about kind of how addictive really is nicotine, and is it any worse than a cup of coffee? I think this is really an interesting question, and I think if that question ever gets posed to you by a student, it's also really interesting to discuss what made you arrive at this idea. It seems like there is a fair amount of kind of social media marketing that's trying to equate nicotine pouches as just kind of an energy performance enhancer. And we hear from people talking about using it before going to the gym or before a night of studying to get locked in. Um, and I think, again, there's this kind of perception perpetuated by what's on social media about equating nicotine to caffeine. But as I'll kind of unpack in a minute, we should not be equating those two addictive products. So, how addictive is nicotine and how bad of an addiction is it, right? So, how do you measure an addiction and how do you measure how bad an addiction is? There's actually, many different facets, different ways of unpacking this. We can look at the prevalence of people addicted. We can look at withdrawal severity, reinforcement, tolerance and dependence. We can also look at impact, right? The intoxication, what use of that chemical is doing to your body. And this is a question that researchers have been investigating over the years. This is a figure from a paper in the Lancet, which is a premier medical journal, where they kind of broke down different, many different addictive substances. I know it's kind of hard to see what's there on the bottom, but we have tobacco over there in the middle, and they kind of came up with their own equation for harm, looking at a whole array of factors, including mortality, damage to the body, impairment of mental functioning, loss of relationships, injury, crime, environmental damage, economic costs. And you can see that tobacco is right there next to cocaine. It's pretty high up there, and we're gonna have it's rated higher than other products like cannabis, for example. So if we're talking about broader damage, nicotine is not going to be as impairing as something like alcohol, right? We're not concerned about people getting behind the wheel with nicotine in their systems the way we're worried about people getting behind the wheel with alcohol in their systems. So if we're going to talk about harm in that way and impairment that way, tobacco will be rated a bit lower. But if we talk about dependence, it's kind of a whole different story. When research has looked at the probability of transitioning from use to dependence, so who's kind of using casually and who develops dependence, this is where it breaks down. So among the people who begin using tobacco products, 67% develop a nicotine addiction. That's much higher than most other kind of commonly used substances. Alcohol is 22%, cocaine is 20%, cannabis is under 9%. So when we talk about people, their use developing into an addiction, much lower than something like cannabis, right? 9% of people do kind of develop a cannabis addiction. Over 67% of people who use nicotine develop an addiction to nicotine. So the bottom line here is that nicotine ranks among the most dependence-forming substances studied, despite a milder intoxicating effect than something like alcohol or cannabis. Alcohol. That's not to say, of course, alcohol and cannabis carry real dependence too, but nicotine's conditional risk of dependence, once it's being used regularly, is the highest of the group. Caffeine can cause mild dependence, but it falls well outside the range that researchers would classify as clinically addictive. So if you're talking to people about addiction, I've noticed that a lot of college students don't want to admit or don't believe that they are addicted. Especially because these perceptions of addiction, meaning, total impairment and disrupting your life. But these are some useful kind of questions when just having a conversation with somebody about their tobacco use. Asking about how soon after waking up do you need to use your vape, or how soon after waking up do you need to, put a nicotine pouch in your mouth? Do you find yourself reaching for your vape or for your pouches without thinking about it? Do you use it more before going into a situation where it's not allowed? And if you haven't been using it for several hours, Do you start feeling anxious or irritable? This one's really interesting. I'll hear people talking about um, going home for spring break, going home for summer break, being at their parents' house, not being able to use at all or as regularly as when they were living on campus, and being like, yeah, I kind of was feeling really crummy. I was feeling kind of gross and kind of irritable. And, that's withdrawal. That's a sign that you are addicted, and that's your withdrawal symptoms showing. All right, so I'm just going to spend a few minutes now talking about what research is being done. As I said, these are still very emerging products, so we don't have answers to everything, and we want to get answers so we can make really evidence-based, informed decisions and recommendations. So at Ohio State University, we have a Center for Tobacco Research funded by the NCI and the FDA that's meant to look at a lot of these questions. And specifically, the OSU T-Course is looking at three dimensions of nicotine. So digging a little more into the science, there's many different ways that the tobacco industry can manipulate nicotine. Concentration is probably something you're all familiar with, right? So the amount of nicotine in a product can vary. Even cigarettes over the past several decades have become, have had higher levels of nicotine concentration. When we talk about something like an e-cigarette or a nicotine pouch, it's usually somewhere between 0 to 8%, or 0 to maybe 8 milligrams. There are higher options out there, although that's getting pretty high. There's also form. So this is the difference where you go into chemistry classes between freebase and a nicotine salt. So freebase is kind of what has traditionally been in cigarettes. It's what makes it, when a person takes their first puff of a cigarette and it's really harsh and they're coughing and they can feel it in their throat. Tobacco industry learned how to make a protonated form of that nicotine, which lowers the pH, making it less harsh. And that's what Juul actually, their kind of big innovation was that they introduced with their products. A result is that it feels a little safer. So it's just as addictive, just as, just the same amount of nicotine, but the experience feels safer because it doesn't give that kind of harsh throat hit. And then there's also type. This is somewhat newer. We traditionally have our tobacco-derived nicotine, but the tobacco industry has also learned how to synthetically derive nicotine in the laboratory. Getting into the molecular levels, different isomers are happening and different ratios of RNS isomers. This was an innovation brought in by Puff Bar. We also see synthetic nicotine in most nicotine pouches. So for all of these, they're still considered tobacco products since nicotine is what defines a tobacco product, even if it's not derived directly from the tobacco plant. And the OSU T-Course is interested in the consequences of all these different manipulations for addictive potential, because we don't know, for example, what those RS isomers, what the pH levels might be doing in terms of the rapidity of nicotine absorption or other kind of impacts on trajectories of use. Within this OSU T-Course, there's a lot of laboratory research happening right now. I'm also co-leading a project that's the kind of longitudinal cohort to examine what's happening in real time with people. So we're right now still enrolling people aged 13 to 25 who've recently started using e-cigarettes or nicotine pouches. We're enrolling folks from all over the US. So it is technically a convenience sample, and we're monitoring enrollment to ensure sufficient representation of different priority populations. People enrolled in this study are followed over 2 years. They're surveyed every 6 months, and then they also use kind of phone-based surveys to do real intense data collection bursts. As I said, we are still enrolling for this, so if you know anyone who might be interested, it's a paid research study. Please, let me know as well. We're everybody. We're trying to get to 1,500 by the end of August, so every person counts. Currently, we're still enrolling, but we're up to over 13,062 as of the end of June. And as I said, everyone enrolled in this cohort is someone who recently started using either e-cigarettes or nicotine pouches. So this is kind of the breakdown of e-cigarette and nicotine pouch use in the sample. Those of you who are mathematically minded probably notice this adds to more than 100%, and that's because we do have people who are using both products, so we have a lot of dual use going on in the sample. The most popular e-cigarette brands we're observing right now in this national survey are Geek Bar, Juul, Breeze, Raz, Elf Bar. Also, Lost Mary has kind of come up recently. And the most popular nicotine pouch brands are Zyn, Velo, Rogue, Free, and On. So last part of my presentation today, I'm going to talk a bit about kind of the risk and protective factors. So why are college students using these products? And then I'll talk a bit about what can be done. So why are college students using these products? As a social scientist, I often use models like this. This is the socio-ecological model to kind of conceptualize the many layers of factors that influence an individual's behavior. So if we think about individual level factors, we might think about, personality characteristics like people who are higher sensation seeking, or kind of interpersonal characteristics like peer use and family use. Having a parent who uses tobacco is one of the strongest predictors of whether a person will go on to use tobacco themselves. Moving out to the institutional level, we can look at kind of what's happening at your college campus environment with enforcement agencies, with local and state health departments. We can look at more broadly what's happening in your city community in terms of exposure to tobacco marketing and retailer density, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then at our broadest level, we have policies that can kind of impact these environments that we live in. So policies like the Tobacco Control Act or Tobacco 21, which raised the legal age for selling tobacco in the US from 18 to now 21. So to go in depth a little into some of these factors, at the individual level, we can turn to that research study I mentioned previously from the Journal of American College Health, where we gave people a list of reasons that we'd heard anecdotally and from other tobacco studies for why someone might use tobacco. We asked to select kind of your top reasons for using tobacco. The most commonly selected reason was, I like the buzz. And the other reasons for using nicotine pouches were using nicotine pouches enhances the feeling of alcohol or other substances. Nicotine pouches keeps me alert and focused when studying. We also saw that really commonly with the graduate students that we sampled, and to help quit or reduce my use of vapes or e-cigarettes. So this is really interesting. It suggests that, especially the ones about a buzz and enhancing the feeling of alcohol or other substances, it suggests that people are using this for recreational purposes. I think there's hopes that nicotine pouches could be used as kind of a harm reduction product to help people move from maybe something more harmful like cigarettes to something less harmful like nicotine pouches. We might still see that with older adults, but what we're seeing with young adults is that it's really just primarily being used for recreational reasons. And then when we asked the people who reported not using nicotine pouches, their reasons for not using, the most common reason was, I'm worried about the long-term health effects, which is great. That is what we want to see. In the TCORS project that I mentioned, where we're surveying young people, we have an embedded study where we're asking them to rate different products. So we show them packages of different nicotine pouches, and this is a within person study. So each participant just saw one product, and they answered questions about kind of positive ideas related to it. So, how much do you like this product? And also negative items like how addictive do you think it is? How harmful do you think it is? And these were the results. We asked about mint and citrus and different brands to kind of be able to collapse across these different products. Found the highest positive scores were for mint Zyn, and Zyn in general was rated most positively, maybe just because it's such a familiar product to everybody. But something that stood out to us as well is that the negative ratings were just as high as the positive ratings. So people were recognizing the harm and addictive potential of these products. Nevertheless, they found them appealing. We're going to keep looking into this, but it does suggest that arguments about the harm and addictiveness of nicotine pouches might not be enough to prevent people from using them, right? That they're aware that they're harmful, they're aware that they're addictive, um, but we might need to intervene on what's causing these very positive and appealing ideas about the products as well. Right, moving upstream. So how do we get to these positive perceptions? Well, as I alluded to before, when we talk about tobacco, we have to talk about marketing. Um, those of you my age or older probably recognize this guy, Joe Camel. He was a popular Camel cigarette icon, and actually, cigarette companies are no longer allowed to advertise with cartoon products, specifically because they have been found to appeal to children. But this goes back to a very long history of tobacco marketing by the tobacco industry, using different appealing images, appealing celebrities, trying to evoke a certain type of image of people who use this product and what they're like. Um, and marketing to young people and marketing to vulnerable groups has been kind of a part of the tobacco industry playbook for decades as well. So appealing to Black Americans, appealing to the LGBTQ community has been just a very standard part of their marketing scheme. And also the idea of starter products. So this kind of picture you can see here was found. This had to be released as part of the mass settlement agreement. So this was a tobacco industry document memo for chewing tobacco, smokeless tobacco, where they discussed this idea of starter products. And a lot of industry marketing schemes are based on this kind of starter scheme where we kind of work people up to become lifelong users, starting with brands or parts of brands that are kind of sweeter, less harsh, a little bit less nicotine to make it easier for a novice to start using. So something like Skoal's Bandit Sweet, and then moving people up, graduating them to harsher products. So when we think about the broader scheme of marketing products like e-cigarettes and nicotine pouches, we have to kind of consider it in this broader context. Um, Although Juul e-cigarettes claimed that they were not trying to appeal to young people, these were pictures taken from their launch party where they invited young people and social media folks to participate and take lots of pictures of Juul. Other marketing approaches that have been tried include making claims that can be a bit confusing. The use of synthetic nicotine has been twisted to the term tobacco free, which sounds very safe, but it's important to understand that even though it is not derived from a tobacco product, it still contains nicotine. So tobacco free does not mean nicotine free. And lots of ads going on social media as well. We're seeing Zyn, for example, there's another kind of tobacco-free nicotine pouches being advertised on this Facebook ad. More recently, Zinfluencers is a term that my undergrad assistants have been telling me about. These TikTok ads by getting hundreds of thousands of views by folks who are promoting sweepstakes. For example, the young woman in that picture is talking about the points that her boyfriend earns so she can buy cool products, and these kind of Zyn sweepstakes. Or this the young man on the right talking about using Zyn before he goes to the gym with a caption, "Eat, sleep, Zyn, repeat." And just kind of the broader idea that big tobacco is behind almost everything. So when I talk about big tobacco, it's generally these four companies: Philip Morris International, British American Tobacco, Japan Tobacco International, and Imperial Brands. For example, British American Tobacco owns Camel, Newport, and Views. And Philip Morris has Marlboro cigarettes, IQOS, and Zyn. Um, to talk specifically not just about online and social media, with marketing, I want to just take a minute to also talk about marketing at the retailer point of sale. So this is probably an egregious example, but we do see retailers like this. If you go into a convenience store, if you go into a grocery store, a dollar store, you can see a lot of different types of tobacco products being advertised, including that power wall. So tobacco companies pay stores and have contracts with stores to have their products kind of up high on that shelf behind the cashier. Here's a picture I took in Ohio. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. All the tobacco ads that exist at any type of retailer point of sale. This has led me to focus some of my research on tobacco retailer density. To clarify this term, it's how many retailers are licensed to sell tobacco within a certain area or per capita. Tobacco retailers aren't just tobacco shops, they can be any type of store that sells tobacco. Convenience stores are actually the most common type of tobacco retailer. And retailer density is a concern because lots of research shows that a greater density of tobacco retailers provides more access, including to people who are underage, more exposure to tobacco marketing, including to people who are underage, and also for people trying to make a quit attempt. There's lots of other research showing that more access, more exposure can distort perceptions about the availability and popularity of tobacco, increase curiosity about tobacco use, increase the likelihood of initiation, and impede a smoking cessation attempt. For those of you here in Ohio, we've looked at retailer density in our state. This map is showing you tobacco retailer density with darker colors indicating a greater per capita density. So here we have Columbus, where Ohio State University is located. And then I'm circling here other urban centers. So what we found statistically is that even accounting for population size, so per capita, there's a greater density of tobacco retailers in urban centers. Then around those areas, there's kind of a lighter gray color, and that's the suburb effect. So in more advantaged areas, we see less density. And then our state also has a lot of rural places. There's the Appalachian region of Ohio. And again, accounting for population size, we had a greater density of tobacco retailers in rural areas. Drilling into the urban effect, this is Franklin County where Columbus is located. And this map is showing you poverty rates. So darker colors, darker red, are census tracts with a higher poverty rate. And when you overlay this with tobacco retailer density, you can see how much of a relationship there is. And we, of course, show this statistically. So we're seeing these inequalities in where tobacco retailer density is located. And I should note there's also a good amount of research showing that we see clustering around college campuses as well. Okay, so last part of my talk, I'll be speaking a bit about what can be done about all this. So I will again kind of refer to my sociological model and work my way out from individual out to policy levels. At the individual level, there's a lot of counseling, cessation approaches geared towards young people that have now been developed and empirically evaluated. One in particular that I'd recommend is this app-based one developed by the Truth Initiative called This Is Quitting. I have the website here, and you can access this app by texting Ditch Vape, and it will give you kind of personalized information, kind of matching a bit where you are and helping you with a quit attempt. Here are some other resources. There's the Become an X program, resources for people before they start planning out a quit attempt from teensmoking.gov. The American Heart Association has a step-by-step guide with tips for quitting. The CDC has some also useful resources for cessation. And then the American Cancer Society also provides some resources on the benefits of quitting, preparing to quit, and other support. So these are all great resources to help guide a young adult who's considering a quit attempt or maybe really trying to seriously start it. I will say a lot of young people, if they do make a quit attempt, are very likely to just try the cold turkey attempt, which is where you just kind of stop using immediately without any resources, without any counseling, without any nicotine replacement therapy. And unfortunately, going cold turkey is the least effective of the methods for quitting. So if you're talking to a young person who's interested in quitting, or any adult who's interested in quitting nicotine, um, seeking out resources, even if it's just getting an app on your phone, can be really, really effective. And then tips for helping a smoker quit. These are from the American Lung Association, but providing support, offering to visit during a quit attempt. There's different phases, but especially the beginning phase of quitting is really difficult. So these are some useful tips for providing support. It's also good to know that, especially for people who are very established in their tobacco use, people often don't succeed in their first quit attempt. And so it's really important that people are aware of that, and that a first failure at quitting shouldn't be seen as a inability to quit. It just means that you're not, you've started your journey and you just need to keep going. Great advice to give somebody who said, "Oh, I've tried to, quit 3 times and it hasn't worked." Great feedback is just to say, "Wow, you've tried quitting 3 times. Quitting must be very important to you." Moving out in our socio-ecological model, implementing interventions at kind of the social norm level is really important, especially on college campuses where there's that idea that everybody's doing it, or people can kind of have inflated ideas about how common a certain behavior is, often because it's so visible. These are some examples of social norms campaigns that have been used on college campuses that are trying to, on the left, they're trying to correct misperception. So think everybody's drinking, think again. 86% of these students do not drink alcohol. Or this one on the right from the University of Kentucky, which was actually trying to use social norms to help people respect the smoke-free campus law. So this quote saying, "I'm a smoker, but I don't smoke on campus because I respect UK students." There's also opportunities for counter messaging. So taking what social media or what you're seeing online and kind of countering that. The Truth Initiative is great at these kinds of ideas. For example, calling e-cigarettes the depression stick because of the relationship between nicotine and mental health. So for those of you who are interested in developing a protocol, there are some recommended steps, including developing a pool of messages and images. There's some great research papers about, and even with kind of sampled messages that have been kind of shown to be effective among young people. Finding topics that can resonate with teens include making it personally relevant, making it anti-industry, talking about health effects, making sure when you pick images that they're aligned with whatever message you've selected. Pilot testing is always an important next step. So testing those with members of your target audience, whoever they may be, and kids will be very brutally honest. And then refining and pilot testing is needed. For those of you who are interested in counter messaging, there's some really useful toolkits out there to help develop either social media campaigns, for your campus, or posters, flyers to put up to help with kind of counter messaging. These are some great tools from a student who actually worked on a toolkit with me. You can see these are the different themes that she targeted as well. Moving out to kind of the environmental level, I had mentioned, or I discussed a bit, retailer density. there are policies that exist to restrict or reduce retailer density. And the one I want to point out here is school-based. So there are localities that will implement school-based restrictions, just like they might have rules about gun sales being close to schools or, pornography being sold close to schools. You can also restrict retailers from being close to schools. And there are jurisdictions that have included universities in that description. And this is a great way to help prevent kind of a predatory retailer approach of kind of surrounding, clustering around college campuses. So a great way to kind of cut down on that easy access to tobacco products. And then finally, tobacco-free campuses. I think a lot of our campuses are smoke-free, but making sure the language incorporates tobacco-free, which could, making sure it's explicitly including vapes, that it's explicitly including nicotine pouches in its tobacco-free policy. And there are often grants to help support this. So the Truth Initiative, for example, many years provides funds to help campus programs kind of develop and implement a tobacco and nicotine-free college campus program. Right, well, that brings me to the end of my presentation. I will stop sharing in a minute. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Roberts. We did have quite a few questions come in, and so I can kind of field them to you. So here, this is kind of a two-part question. I'll break it in. I'll break it up. We've seen a lot of students find nicotine pouches through social media content with misinformation about nicotine. Do you have any thoughts on how we can interrupt that pathway?
Yes, so that's those influencer issues we're seeing. So I think at the very end, when I talked a bit about counter marketing, that can be really helpful. And I'd love to see more content developed around that, especially, helping to break that misinformation that people are kind of implicitly making the connection between, equating nicotine with caffeine, trying to help people understand the seriousness of nicotine addiction.
Thank you. They also said that they've noticed a lot of nicotine pouch use in specific populations, like you identified athletes, men, and Greek life. Have you heard anything about how to get to those specific populations?
That is a great question. And no, I haven't seen a whole lot of like interventions or approaches that are specifically targeting those groups. Um, I am not an alcohol researcher, but I imagine there is precedent for kind of doing alcohol reduction and pairing with, Greek life there or with um, finding, leaders or champions within those communities. I think that would be a great way to kind of intervene and correct misinformation.
So I know you are not an alcohol researcher. We have someone that asked, do you have any data related to the co-use of Zins and alcohol among college students?
Yes, so it is very high. I'm afraid I don't have like the numbers at the tip of my fingers right now, but yeah, we're seeing a lot of dual use, poly use, kind of going into that party, kind of reinforcing that partying idea.
Another question asked, do you know of any data around the efficacy of like texting support programs?
Yes, so the This Is Quitting program has been evaluated, and so they have been found to be effective. It's difficult because quitting nicotine is hard. So any cessation program has low quit rates, but those programs do seem to perform better, definitely better than cold turkey, and often better than kind of the standard kind of like treatment as usual.
And then how should campuses support students who may not identify as tobacco users but regularly use nicotine pouches?
Great question too. I think it's important when you're asking and when you're doing surveys to ask about the behavior rather than the identity. So saying, "Are you a smoker?" is going to get you different responses than asking, "Have you used a cigarette in the past year?" Or have you, and we'll hear this from students, "Oh, I'm not really a vapor, but Yeah, I guess I do use it once a week or usually every day. So asking about the behavior is important. We've also heard recently from students, they often don't recognize the term oral nicotine pouches, which is what the research community has been using. And one of my trainees was doing a study, and the students were saying, "What's an oral nicotine pouch?" So using nicotine pouches or even just Zins themselves, often it's just identified by the brand, using that language to help make sure they understand what you're asking about.
Thank you. And I think we just have one more question. Are there any harm reduction like campaigns or posters that campuses could, get access to the materials and, print them and hang them on their campus?
Yes, so Stanford has a really good um, um, set of products. I probably won't be able to find it in real time right now, but Anthony, I can send it to you if you want, if people are interested to forward it along. But yeah, rather than reinventing the wheel, there's a lot of good products out there from Stanford.
Yeah, if you find that resource, I'm happy to include it where we post the recording so folks can have access to those materials as well. I don't see any other questions, but thank you so much, Dr. Roberts, for again sharing of your expertise and for answering all the questions that came in. I do just have a couple of closing housekeeping slides. Again, just a few reminders of our upcoming events taking place. Next week, we have the Recovery is Spoken Here, Train the Trainer taking place on the 15th. We have our biennial review learning collaborative taking place at the end of the month on July 29th. Our next water cooler chat will be taking place on August 11th and will be focused on campus naloxone efforts. Additionally, our next webinar will be taking place in August on the 26th, and we'll be focusing on understanding cryptocurrencies and prediction markets. We have recently rescheduled our grant writing crash course, and it is now taking place September 17th, and we still have registration open for that event. And additionally, our 2026 national meeting will be taking place virtually October 19th through the 22nd in 2026, and early bird registration runs through the end of the month. Just as a friendly reminder that today's session has been recorded and you can expect to see it uploaded to our website within 5 business days. Thank you everybody for joining us today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care all.